You can still see?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Lucy and Sarah, before you leave.
Thank you.
Yeah. Whoa.
I think someone's there, yeah, sorry.
How crazy.
Bustling into your territory.
Good, how are you?
Look, it's a common theme.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we start up, just very quickly, if you have not checked your email, I sent a longish email this morning. You don't have to do it immediately if you want. Just talking about the midterm, all right? And to more or less set everything that you have to know for it. As I said, everything will be online. The password there in the email. Make sure you reviewed stuff from lecture and from the reading, and basically everything is included in what we've done, of course, including on Wednesday. So it will be the last lecture. All right, start studying now, but again, it's not until Friday. You do not need blue books because all of it will be on Blackboard. Please.
So are we going to take that in class online or just stay.
Then you can be wherever you want to be. The object was to create an equal experience for everybody. So, because I can't force those people who are off campus to come on campus. So, the one benefit for all of you, although you may not consider this a benefit depending on how much time everyone wants to spend with this exam, is I've given everyone more time because I realize in the past sometimes people struggle to finish this exam. So I've given everyone 90 minutes to complete it. So around 45 minutes an essay. Which should be more. It should be enough time to be able to complete this essay well. 2 essays. So 2 essays you have to do. The second one will include sources which I will provide for you. Please.
Are the essays going to be the size of the quiz that we had, or are you expecting like introduction?
Even a little bit longer, I would say, because you'll have more time at your disposal. So I'll expect more of you. Again, there's no exact. I don't have an exact idea of how long I want essays to be. The question is, have you answered the question fully? Have you given me what you have, more or less? Have you explained yourself carefully? Have you answered what I asked you to write on? Have you given me good examples? I'm far more interested in those answers to those questions than if just exactly how long you've written for, or how many lines you come up with. Other questions? Do feel free again to email me questions about content or anything as you begin to review. I'm happy to do that if people do have conceptual questions about things. Or questions about the format, of course. But I think the format's pretty good. 2 essays, do them both. And the window is open the entire day, so you have more than enough opportunity to choose for yourself when you want to write this thing. Do it close to normal class time if you like, or you can write, you can write that in the middle of the night. It really doesn't make any difference to me, so long as you do it at some point during the day. All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to wrap up our discussion on the ancient Greek world, and specifically, I'm going to devote a lecture to what is referred to sometimes as intellectual history, the history of ideas. There's not enough of that in this course. But I think you'll see, especially when it comes to ancient Greek ideas, they have a very long shelf life. They live on long after the ancient Greeks are gone. So it's important that we discuss some of their more important ideas. And in fact, some people would say when it comes to looking at who are some of the people who really lay the foundations for Western intellectual achievements, very often the Greeks are the ones that people point to. It is fair to say, though, before we go on, that again, sometimes people get the incorrect impression that the majority of Greeks were doing these sort of remarkable intellectual feats, whereas most ancient Greeks, like most people today, live outside of the academy. They would have had, many would have had little interest in some of these things we're about to talk about. More Greeks engaged in magic. And it's just one Greek magical papyrus that tells you how to get a demon into being. More of them did magic that really took part in some of these philosophical schools, intellectual schools we'll talk about. It is fair to say, too, that although you really publicly, most people would never openly deny the gods, even those who had radical ideas otherwise. So there were some constraints as to what you could say. As I think you'll see too, you shouldn't think of every single ancient Greek thinker as being exactly the same. There was a wide range of different ideas they had. With all of that being said, most people do tend to locate a revolution in thought in the ancient Greek world. And many historians have asked the simple question, why the ancient Greek world? And the answer that many people have come up with is very really simple. This environment we talked about, the polis, the city-state, was in some ways the absolutely ideal place to begin to formulate new questions. Remember I told you that in many city-states there is a form of collective government and some democracy. People are accustomed to gathering together, stating their viewpoint, choosing between different options, really, people really felt that they had this ability to sort of engage in this sort of debate. And in even some cases, I said that people serving on juries to decide someone's fate. These same habits of mind, okay, I want the evidence, I want to be able to discuss things, I want to be able to choose my own path, that were very useful in political circumstances, also get transferred over to the intellectual world. So you begin to see ancient Greeks questioning some of these fundamental things about reality in a way that we don't, for instance, see in places like Egypt or the ancient Near East that didn't have a tradition of the city-state. What we should do then is break down what are some of these intellectual contributions of the Greeks. The first of these is very simple. The discipline of history, which I mentioned first only because this is a history course, but really, in some ways, in the West, we look back to the Greeks as having created history for the first time. Although you may not know it, the term that we use to describe this discipline, history, is actually a Greek term. It is the Greek term historia, which means inquiry, an investigation, specifically into the past. Now, you may have said, well, listen, some of these primary sources I've read, there are all sorts of chronicles of the Epic of Gilgamesh that talked about things that happened in the past. And that's true. But ancient Greek historians were doing something very different. They were, first of all, writing in prose, not poetry, but they were writing, for instance, just like you would write in a modern-day textbook about events, not in the sort of poetical language that people had used previously. Greek historians often were writing about things that had happened close to their own times, not things in the sort of distant past that no one could really remember. And in fact, for some ancient Greek historians, it was important to investigate through sources or eyewitnesses what had happened, in, for instance, wars that had taken place recently. On top of that, in Greek history now, it's not just simply one thing after the next, as some ancient, even more ancient authors had done, just putting this long list of events. Greek historians begin to ask questions, deeper questions about, okay, well, why did these things happen? What is the connection between these events? So they really begin to instill this air of complexity into history now. It's not just a matter of listing things. You actually have to begin to ask something like, what are the motivations for someone acting in the way they did? Greeks also were absolutely fearless in plunging into areas of science and mathematics. Now, this is not to say that all Greeks necessarily relied on these explanations. I show you, this is a famous image well, the image is not famous. The story is famous, but this one Greek, Prometheus, who supposedly had stolen fire from the gods and then brought it down. And that was the origin story for many ancient Greeks of how fire comes into the world. So very similar, in fact, to many other ancient civilizations that they love these kind of origin stories. I put this one up in particular because everyone always likes the feel-good part of the story where he gets fire and he brings it down to humanity. But no one likes the other part of the story where the gods then round him up and decide that every single day a bird will come down and feast upon his liver. And then during the night, his liver regenerates. So the bird gets to do it again the next day and again this day. So there's danger in messing with the gods. All right, with that being said, people begin now to rely in the Greek world upon explanations that are much more impersonal. They don't necessarily involve the god or gods. They don't really involve anything except talking about matter and how it acts. There's no myth in some of these explanations. And in fact, just to show how, in many ways, optimistic the Greeks were, they generate the first theories of matter that we've ever heard of. What is this stuff around us that everything is made up of? In fact, there's actually one Greek school of thought that sometimes referred to as the atomic theory, not because They knew how to create nuclear weapons, but because this school said that everything you see around you is made up of what they refer to as atoms, these teeny little particles that all combine together to form larger things. This was based upon no experimental data whatsoever, but this was a theory that in fact proved later on, much later on, to be correct. Because there's no unanimous one sort of school of thought in the Greek world, though, there's also a second competing school of thought that said, in fact, the people who said that everything is made up of atoms were wrong. In fact, everything was made up of air, water, earth, and fire. And these four different substances would combine in slightly different proportions to form what we see. Of the two schools of thought, that was the winner. In fact, that is the school of thought that later generations would tend to look back on and agree with for quite a long time. Greeks were also innovators in arithmetic and geometry, as much as your high school self may hate that fact, but it's undoubtedly true. To give you just one example of a famous Greek mathematician, this is a papyrus from the ancient Greek mathematician Euclid, who produces what likely is the most successful textbook in history, and that is not meant to be an insult. In fact, this is a textbook that was used probably more often by later generations than any other. Again, especially dealing with matters having to do with geometry, Euclid was really an innovator. In part, it's Euclid's individual findings about geometry that are important. But perhaps even in a wider scale, what's important about Euclid's work is he sets out a theory, a method of actually thinking about knowledge that actually becomes influential even outside of math. He says, for instance, what he divided, there's two different kinds of propositions that he makes. One of these things are called axioms, which are ideas or propositions that are so basic that he feels that as soon as you hear them, you almost have to agree with them. He's forced to agree with them. And then what you can do is take those sort of foundational blocks and combine them together to form more complicated arguments known as theorems. And this is the method he sets out in his textbook, and the method that's become enormously popular in math and beyond. And again, in part because the simplicity and clarity of this method really made it recommended to others. One of the later Greeks who would build upon Euclid's work is known as Archimedes, who again is a mathematician in part. And one of the things he really spends a lot of time trying to figure out is how do you figure out how big a circle or a sphere is? It was not actually obvious to anyone before this point. And one of the things he has to do to be able to figure out how to measure these accurately is he comes up with the concept of pi, which I won't go through here because we're all going through high school math. But if you ever wondered, why does pi have a Greek letter that they use? Because in fact it's a Greek, Archimedes, who figures out this idea for the first time. Supposedly Archimedes, in addition to just doing his sort of work in his own office, he also at one point he has to try to defend his city against invading Romans. He comes up with this group of sort of booby traps. These are contraptions meant to sort of end up stopping the Romans from entering the city. It doesn't work. He ends up being killed, and much of the city saw it. But it was a good attempt anyway. Practical knowledge in addition to just his speculation. This to show you, by the way, that there is knowledge left to be discovered in the world. For a long time, we had really lamented the fact that almost all of Archimedes' works were lost, but the later generations would not copy them. For the simple reason that why would you want to copy something that you don't understand? His work is so complicated that in some cases people just didn't follow it. In relatively recent years, though, one of the tricks we've learned, and one of the ways we've recovered at least a portion of his works, is this is it's very complicated to look at. This is a Greek manuscript. If you were just to look at it with your open eye, what it looks like is the Psalms written in Greek. And what had ended up happening, though, is a later Greek monk had taken this manuscript, he had scratched out the work of Archimedes, and he put the Psalms in its place, which he felt was much more useful. Modern historians, of course, don't agree. And instead, what they've done is if you apply infrared light to this manuscript, what you'll see actually is the original words often from Archimedes reappear. So we've actually reconstructed some of the text by using this method. Some in the Greek world, again, especially ones who already were interested in math, also gaze up at the skies and really begin to figure out many different patterns in astronomy. And in some cases, the discoveries, other ancient peoples had dealt with astronomy, but some of the ancient Greeks' discoveries in astronomy really outstripped any of the basic ideas of their own time. So for instance, so far as we know, the first time anyone suggested that perhaps the center of the universe is the sun, and all the planets revolve around it. Actually makes the most sense. This actually fails to convince mainstream astronomers at the time, but this is the first time anyone really had suggested this idea. Well, what's so interesting about this, I should say, by the way, is that everyone had the correct data. It was just a question of how to interpret the data. So, for instance, the people who said that the Earth is at the center, they knew where the heavenly bodies would be, but they had to create a system that was much more complicated to be able to accommodate the data. Whereas the people who said the sun was the center, everything gets much simpler, much faster. Yeah, please.
Did they also still believe at this time that the Earth was flat?
No, and I think I was going to debunk this later on, but I'll do it now. This is actually this is one of those legends that gets passed down from generation to generation in school books. That there was a time where everyone felt the Earth was flat. There were a few people in the Middle Ages who felt that the Earth was flat. The overwhelming majority of people always knew that the Earth is a globe. This lie for Aristotle in the 18th century that everyone thought the world was flat before Columbus set sail or something, but that really was not the case. So the Greeks didn't believe it, and virtually no one else believed it either. It was a small percentage of people who ever had this idea. Because how would we be able to sail if they thought the world was flat? Don't you think they recognized that, in fact, that the way that the sun moves and it really wouldn't have made much sense. But I'm glad to bring that up. What we see then is, again, a lot of Greeks, using their tools, will continue to think, really come up with these very complicated schemes of how the planets interact with one another. In addition to that, the Greeks also begin to make the first calculations about how big is the Earth anyway. This is a question that no one has really asked. So, for instance, this really is a very clever method that this one Greek scholar ends up using. He was the city of Alexandria in Egypt, and there's this sort of big building. And what he would do, very cleverly, is he begins to measure where shadows fall at different points of the day. And he extrapolates this teeny bit of information to come up with an estimate of the circumference of the entire Earth that's only around 150 miles off of the actual number. Which you may say, well, it's wrong. But, if you contemplate how crude these methods were, he didn't do a bad job at all. I dare say I wouldn't be able to measure the circumference of the Earth that well using just the shadows of one building. Greeks also become known in the field of sciences for medicine specifically. And in fact, in the ancient world, if you wanted to get a doctor normally, the attitude was you go to a Greek because they know what they're talking about. Very often, the first the first people in the ancient Greek world are recognized as a great doctor, a great physician. It's known as Hippocrates, who lived on this teeny little Greek island. And we know very little about him. And he never actually wrote anything at all. He had disciples who would carry on his ideas, and they're the ones who wrote down his ideas about medicine for the first time. Hippocrates and other ancient Greeks, the real contribution they make to medicine is simple. It's that it doesn't make much sense to come up with a theory and about how people's health works without actually testing it, without observing what effect do these things have on the patient. And you may say, well, that's the most obvious thing in the world. But in fact, the way that doctors tended to proceed was the exact opposite. They would come up with a theory, and they wouldn't actually very carefully look to see how different treatments affected people or how different diseases. They would just come up with these sort of theories they dreamt up themselves. Hippocrates went further, though. He actually gave all sorts of recommendations how to treat patients. For instance, patients, you really have to view the patient as a whole. You can't just look at the sickness. You have to look at the person's, for instance, entire way of life. He taught that the best healing often takes place naturally. Don't do anything in some cases. He said that sometimes a simple diet is conducive to good health. He also taught that the first duty of a doctor is not to himself, but to his patients. All of these things, I should say, by the way, now may appear to be the really things that everybody knows, but not everyone knew at the time. These were new ideas. Please.
Do we know if he's religious at all? Because the statement of the best healing takes place naturally is sounds like a very religious statement of God made the body perfect to heal it.
At least so far as the way he definitely. It's probably conventionally religious, but would believe in God and everything. It appeared that he was making this more sort of a natural basis, not so much as a supernatural healing, but just in terms of that's what he observed often worked, I would say. We also know that Hippocrates, another chapter, does his own research, specifically into epilepsy, which they knew at the time. But previous up to this point, everyone had said that epileptics, this was basically a curse that was given to you by the gods. And what he says instead is that he feels that epilepsy is a natural condition. It's probably rooted in the brain, and he felt it had definite causes. One of which, by the way, he said is probably an inheritable disease. You notice that it ran in families. And he even actually said that perhaps epilepsy can be cured by medicine. Now, we still have no medicine to cure epilepsy, but just the ambition here that he felt he could do it is important. And he tosses out the idea that you should be using magical cures. He wants to actually find a real medicine that will help people. Part of the great limitation of both Hippocrates, although frankly any ancient Greek doctor, was very simple. You could only work with what you saw. And can you imagine, for instance, not knowing anything about microorganisms? They really had no knowledge of that. In fact, even some of the things that, very obvious statements about the anatomy of the body were things that they didn't have access to initially. And so what ancient Greek doctors begin to do is, in some cases, they actually will, this is not tasteful, but they'll actually take bodies and they'll cut them open and just look and see what happens, more or less. And in some cases, the better ones, these are dead people. In other cases, people who were condemned to die anyway, there would be no certain ancient Greek doctors who would actually cut open live people who were condemned to death and just to see what happened. You can understand by doing this, they understood circulation of blood very quickly. That's the first thing that comes out. But there are other things that they figured out. Like, for instance, some of the basics of the nervous system They figure out just by process of observation of cutting people open. I'm not saying you should do this, but indeed, these ideas now really were coming just from observation of the naked eye. Please.
This wasn't like to like end up killing them, right? This was just something that they like played around.
Oh no, yeah, I mean
Oh, just
they would end up
yeah.
dying. Yeah.
Like
These
chop
people
off
condemned to
head.
death anyway. They figure that, you know. I'm not saying this is good. I mean, it's not an ethics class, luckily. Yeah, please.
Did they have any form of anesthesia? They didn't have any form of anesthesia back then.
In the ancient world, the best they could do for you is they could get you really drunk.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, the drunker you are, the less pain you're going to feel. And I don't think it's ideal method.
And you're condemned to die anyway.
Yeah. I mean. Oh. The next topic, this brings me to is one that happily at Benedictine you have done a lot of philosophy. Here I'm only going to give you some of the most important figures in ancient Greek philosophy. Again, even the term for it is love of wisdom. This is a very Greek subject. So some of these ancient Greek intellectuals were spending time on, we may say, slightly more practical subjects. Others, though, begin to ask deeper questions about what is the meaning of life. Once I figure out what the meaning of life is, how do I figure out how to live my life in accordance with that? There's always this second question about, how do I found a school, basically, or someplace to be able to perpetuate this new meaning of life I've discovered. So what kind of different schools? Here, as I said, I'm just running down some of the most essential ones with the knowledge that hopefully in another class we've read more about this or heard more about it. One of the earliest schools we can pick out of the ancient Greek world who begins to do this is a school known as the Sophists, who, especially in some of our later philosophers, always get a bad rap. Because Sophists, they did ask deeper questions about the meaning of life and what you should do, but part of the Sophist game really was that they really felt that you could also do this for a living. That in fact, Sophists said that you far from being sort of an abstract subject, the ability to think quickly on your feet, the ability to speak well, the ability to enter politics, you could all actually improve those skills by doing philosophy. And so they would actually charge people, they'd have people who were their students who they would charge to be able to teach the arts of philosophy, the rules of an argument, for instance, that kind of thing. But they sometimes will ask deeper questions about unraveling meaning in the universe and that sort of thing, mysteries of the universe. One thing that they definitely established, though, is that you can gain some sense of truth by means of reason, by means of your mind alone. And they also taught that you shouldn't accept necessarily explanations that had been given previously. But there really was you might say there was a certain limitation to just how deep Sophists ever really take some of the subjects that they begin to investigate. With that, I will pass on to two people who, as I said, you probably at some point have heard about. These two people are Socrates and Plato. And there is a real reason why I bring these two up in the same breath, which is that we basically have almost no sources about Socrates that really go back to him himself. Almost everything we know about Socrates comes from his student, Plato, which is problematic in some ways because his student Plato thought that Socrates is kind of like this kind of martyr for philosophy, this sort of hero of philosophy, and that's the way he depicts it. So it's very difficult for us to be able to separate Socrates from Plato's depiction of him. There's no way to do it practically. So far as we can really puzzle out what Socrates himself taught, he clearly was someone who, unlike the Sophists, felt that you should be doing philosophy without expectation of material gain. He was someone who felt that money kind of sullies the process of thinking. what we can tell that Socrates seemed to do a lot of was he thought a lot about what was the human soul exactly, what role did it have. And by the way, again, this idea of a soul is not one that necessarily all ancient peoples shared. So he's someone who really puts this idea out there that there is a soul. It appears that Socrates was constantly on the sort of search for what is the truly good, possessed his thoughts. As some of you will know already, for Socrates, especially in that period of time where the ancient Greeks are engaged in that long civil war I talked to you about, the Peloponnesian War, he really picked a very unfortunate time to philosophize, to openly question some of the received truths of society. And in fact, many people began to think that this was a bad time to be doing this and that he might end up corrupting young men. And so he ends up actually falling a victim to trumped up charges and ends up actually receiving the death penalty for Athens.
Wait, Plato or Socrates?
We're still on Socrates.
Okay.
We'll pass over to Plato in a moment, I promise. Among the other ideas that in some cases, again, really for later generations become very important, we think is that this whole sort of concept of how Socrates taught. It's obvious to us from many sources that he was someone who felt that a lot of wisdom could be imparted by conversation, by sort of dialogue. And this is something we've seen before with Confucius, for instance, but this is sort of the Western counterpart to it. All right. The second person who I plan to talk about, and again, sort of this duo, this is Plato. And Plato was the student of Socrates, clearly venerated him. And after Socrates' death, Plato attempts to carry on the ideas of Socrates. In addition to simply carrying on these ideas about the soul, which obviously Plato also thought was a valuable teaching, Plato had a very interesting set of ideas about what was the nature of reality. What he felt was that the things that were truly real, the really real, the things that were genuine and really were, in some cases, hidden from our eyes. We couldn't actually see them or experience them with our senses. The things that are truly good. These things go beyond the simple material world. And the only access we have to these things is through our souls. The only access we have to this non-physical plane of existence. These true realities were things like, for instance, the good, truth, beauty, justice. All of these things were things beyond, you could actually see, but they were there. As your soul was the key to getting them. Plato, probably even more than Socrates, really popularizes this idea of the soul. There's so many people who read Plato's works afterwards. This idea that the soul is apart from the body imprisons the soul. And you can tell, by the way, that Plato, some of these ideas about the soul, and if you just substitute for the good God. Many Christian authors also love Plato because his ideas were close enough in many ways that they could actually be combined, Christian ideas. I should also say, though, lest I just sit around and praise how great Plato is, some of you will know too that he also wrote this work referred to as the Republic that became enormously popular, that essentially gives his ideal form of a polis, a place that he thought should be ruled over by philosophers, which is an interesting idea to start out with. And he did feel that society should allow you to fulfill ethical ideals. So it was a controversial work, though, even in his own time, though, even though that This polis he described would be extremely well ordered. There'd be a lot of thought going on, a lot of morality, but it was also this kind of joyless, authoritarian place where, for instance, censorship was used because you didn't want to have bad ideas come in and circulate among people. There's nothing there now, but in its heyday, this was the academy. This was the school that Plato founded to further both Socrates' ideas and his own ideas, which for generations afterwards would be the center of philosophy in the Western world. Now, Plato would end up having many of his own students at this academy. By far the most famous of them, and again, one of these are household names among philosophers. You don't say that very often, but this is one of them. This is his student, Aristotle. And Aristotle did go to the academy of Plato, but in some ways he disagreed strongly with some of the ideas that Plato had. And perhaps no more than this idea I was telling you about, that the really real, the things that are like truth and justice are beyond our senses. Aristotle really seemed to have very little patience with this concept that the real is beyond human senses. What really seemed is that Aristotle felt that he wanted to know everything, basically. He wanted to bring all this information together. And he wanted to then, whenever he made statements, have as much data from the real world as possible to be able to feel that he had really covered them completely. So there was this real faith in everything in Aristotle of the powers of observation to be able to figure out how the world ran and experienced. So a lot of his work, we think, ends up being encyclopedic in nature, bringing together all the knowledge of his day. Now, there's a problem, though, that Aristotle faced, which was that if you have a lot of information, you don't want to just dump it on people. You have to figure out some way to present it. And in fact, I don't need to tell you what Aristotle's system for how to present knowledge, because all of you have learned it at some point, although it didn't have Aristotle's name attached to it. If you have written an essay at any point in your life, it has an introduction, has a body with your information, has a conclusion, you are basically using the system that Aristotle taught us all. And it's become so present in academia, or just in schools of all kinds, that you don't even think that it started with somewhere. But it didn't fall from the sky. Aristotle created this system to be able to present this knowledge in the best way. Like Plato, we think that Aristotle also had interest in reforming the state. For him, the idea of the best kind of state aimed at happiness. For him, happiness was that you could, of course, exercise your reason to the fullest degree. And by doing so, be able to achieve a state of morality and moral excellence. So at least one big part of this sort of system that Aristotle created, creating happiness, was this thing he referred to as the mean. Not doing too much, not doing too little. So not abstaining from alcohol completely, and not just getting plastered all the time, but drinking some of wine with a mean between the two extremes, which you felt would be the place you want to aim for. Yeah.
Is meat just like balance, basically?
Yeah, that sort of it was specifically it's like that middle point, right, between the three extremes. Yeah. Now, what was interesting about the Greek world, though, is that no one forced any of these philosophies upon you. Taking classes here, they're forced upon you, perhaps. In the ancient Greek world, you could choose these philosophies, you could reject them entirely, or you could found an entirely new school that had ideas that were antithetical to these schools. And I can't go through all the different Greek schools, we'll be all day, but I will at the end here mention 3 of these other paths that people took. They're a little distinctive among Greek philosophical schools. The first of these is a school known as the Cynics, and this is just one image of the founder of this school of thought. This is a more modern statue. People always ask me, of course, do they like dogs? And the answer is maybe. But the real reason the dog is here is that the Greek word for dog is actually very closely related to the term cynic. And in fact, we think that the term cynic starts off as an insult. You guys behave like a bunch of dogs. And in time, they start to like it. They just refer to themselves as cynics from that term of insult originally. The Cynics had a school of thought that, like many of these schools of thought, their attitude was, you have to pursue virtue. You have to cultivate virtue. Well, okay, what did that mean specifically in their case? Well, the Cynics had an answer to that question, which is to say that the truly moral person has to live a life that is very close to nature. You have to live a life that's in correspondence with nature. And they tended to be very down on most people in their own world who they felt did not accomplish this aim. So, for instance, they felt that the truly good life was really to withdraw from civilization altogether and live a life that by our standards would be really very harsh, very minimal, and do what they said came naturally to human beings. So, for instance, he felt that what was truly natural, this school of thought, was to renounce material possessions. There's the story of the founder of the school of thought, for instance, who had given up everything he owned except for just one little cup. And then he saw once a little boy who was trying to get some water. He just cupped his hands and took the water and drank it out. And then he realized he'd been bested by the little boy who had truly, he didn't even need the cup, so he got rid of the cup too. And no material possessions. We also think that the Cynics were kind of this school of people kind of like were filthy, kind of they stank to high heaven, and they would wander around sort of haranguing passersby, telling them that they were living their lives really in a way that was totally out of whack with nature. And in fact, they said, in fact, most of the social conventions, the way we lead our lives in civilization, that just removes us from nature. In fact, it makes us less natural but less human simultaneously. And so they say that traditional morality is a load of nonsense. And in fact, many of the things that Cynics do when they arrive at towns would be things that would be viewed really as disgusting. For instance, they would go to the bathroom publicly because they said, aha, that is what's natural to human beings. You know, you don't need to go to anywhere special. They would have sex openly in public, which again offended many of the people in their own time as well. But they would say, that's the point. You are so used to leading this conventional life that you don't understand what comes natural to human beings. So we try to shock people's sensibilities on purpose. One of the stories, of course, also is told about them. If you read the life of Alexander the Great, supposedly its founder was once just lying down in the sun, and Alexander the Great just came right on by next to him, and he stood in front of him and said, what is it that I can give to you? And what the founder of the school of the Cynics said was, what I really want is for you to step to the side because you're blocking my sun. That in turn was correspondence to nature. That almost certainly did not happen. But it's a very good story. It gives you some idea of what these people were all about. One of the other very big schools that gets founded in the ancient Greek world is known as the Epicureans. And this is a school of thought that in its own time would have been extremely controversial. Many Greeks, when they heard about the Epicureans thinking, they said, you people are a bunch of atheists. You deny the existence of gods. The Epicureans, however, defended themselves by saying, listen, we don't know whether or not the gods exist, but whether they exist or not, they have very little influence on the world. So, not saying that the gods didn't exist, but that really wasn't the point for them. What the Epicureans taught instead of having gods at the center of their thought, what they said was the most important thing is that the world is made up of these teeny particles known as atoms. So again, this is one of the different schools of thought from science, now brought over into philosophy. And what they said was that when you die, it's kind of like think of a glass shattering, where the glass goes all over the place. All of these atoms just are dispersed, and they begin to form into other things at that point. The Epicureans taught that rather than just sort of coming up with all sorts of elaborate theories, you should try your best to just look very carefully around you, to observe the world around you, to gain experience, and that is how you should dictate how you lead your life. And, rather than some of the other schools that had higher-minded philosophies, the Epicureans said, what you want to do at the end, your end goal is simply to, as much as possible, to pursue pleasure and to avoid pain. Pretty simple way. And this is actually, by the way, if you have ever heard of the Epicureans, you've heard of the very bad rap that they got, because some people said, well, listen, these people are a bunch of hedonists. All they want to do is, eat, drink, and be merry. The Epicureans would say, listen, it's not, we don't necessarily, we do think you should seek pleasure, but the point is what kind of pleasure? And the Epicureans would say, true pleasure is having good friends, having deep conversations with them, enjoying food, but not necessarily to an excess, not necessarily, just, sensual enjoyment all the time. The other thing that's very interesting to us about Epicureans in comparison to many other schools of thought is that they really do not have a teaching about, they don't have any belief that there is anything beyond this life. They really do think, as I said, so your atoms scatter, but there's nothing that's deeper that happens with your soul. That's the end for you, death. Whereas that may appear to be a despairing sort of idea, what they would say is that, listen, we don't have to waste all of our time being afraid of death and putting all the energy into that, because we already know what happens after death, which is nothing. So, you can spend your time in this life trying to seek out pleasure and not worry so much about what's going to happen in the next life. You can see what, but many people, though, in the ancient Greek world, because some of these ideas they found so distasteful, Epicureans would tend to just go off and lead their lives on their own. Make little communities because they didn't want to have to defend themselves constantly from being atheists and hedonists, etc. All right. The last school of thought that we'll talk about here are known as the Stoics. This is the founder of the Stoics. In some ways, the Stoics are things that you've heard before. They too were a school of thought who felt that's very important to observe the world around us, to fully exercise your reason. I think that we're sound familiar by now. What is very interesting about the Stoics, I think, as a school of thought, is that they really do see that human beings, their behavior, were part of the cosmos as a whole. And we really had some part, human beings had some part in the larger fate of the universe. In fact, and their school of thought was really very optimistic at its core. They believed that human beings were getting better. The world was getting better at the same time. One was influencing the other. And so the way that human beings, they taught, were supposed to act, well, you couldn't just, like the Epicureans, just run off by yourself. You certainly couldn't, like the Cynics, just disgust everybody. They really felt that your purpose in life was to take responsibility for your duties and fulfill them to the best of your ability. And that would actually help the future to be better. With that being said, the Stoics did feel that you could try your best, but ultimately you didn't have control over the sort of broader scheme of things. And the only response of the rational person is to accept everything you get with the same level of complete indifference. Whether it be good things come to you or bad things. You had no part in it, you just have to accept it in the same sort of poker face. And in fact, if you've ever heard the modern word Stoic, that's where this term comes from. Someone who just never shows any emotion, it doesn't matter what happens. Ultimately, you just had to accept what happened to you was the will of fate or the will of the gods. In the meantime, though, as I said, the Stoics spent a lot of time talking about responsibility, about duty, and so if you want to be a virtuous person and help the world, you go out and you do a day job. You can't just philosophize all the time. And so we know, in fact, that in many places, both in the ancient Greek world, and then later on, even in the ancient Roman world, in some cases, people who were even really big-time politicians would end up actually accepting the Stoic school of thought. Because, in fact, it actually jived very well with this sense that you have to go out into the world and do something. Some sort of philosophical backing. Public responsibility was a real thing. And this is, I just here to show, this is one example of a later Roman emperor known as Marcus Aurelius, who's actually also a big-time Stoic philosopher at the same time as being an emperor. Please.
So were the Stoics like the most successful and what they lasted in
Yeah, certainly. I'm sorry, finishing up. This is the last point. Of these three, I would say that the Stoics are the most successful. The Cynics virtually no one joined. The Epicureans was always a sort of small group, but the Stoics really do get one. All right, folks, thanks. We continue on Wednesday. I'll see you then.